My name's Dr. Tobin Grant. I'm chair of Political Science Department. On behalf of the Political Science Department, College of Liberal Arts, Public Policy Institute, Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, and SIU, I want to welcome you to the Morton-Kenney lecture for this spring. In particular, I want to recognize a few people. Dean Mira Camargo, dang it. Mira's going to, yeah, I already apologize. Hiramaju, Camaraju. Sorry, and President Dunn, who's also here. I want to thank them for their support. Jack Tishner, Policy Institute's interim director, thank him for his support. And then want to introduce John Sides. John Sides is well known in political science as well as in policy circles, both for his academic work, which is top notch, and literally, if you take the campaigns class here, you literally will. He wrote the book on it, and he's there. He's one of the reasons, and that we invited him here is also he's been very active over the past few years in bringing findings and understandings from social science and political science, in particular, to a public audience. He and some others co-founded a blog which is called the Monkey Cage blog. The name comes from a quote on democratic theory that they started, and it started building up. Eventually, it got enough recognition. The Week named it Blog of the Year. Later, the Washington Post took it and is now housed at the Washington Post. If you don't follow it, or if you're interested in what Dr. Sides has to say today, what I would do is start following it, follow it on Twitter or other places where you follow the Washington Post. Because what you'll see is some of the top scholars in the field bringing their research and their expertise to bear on topics. Speaking of which, so we'll move with John Sides. He's an expert in political campaigns, and we asked him to talk this. The idea of this being a talk about President Trump was not first in our minds at that point in August of last year, but we figured we'd have something on the election. So instead of this, so he agreed to do it, and then he just scribbled out one name and put another, and now it's on Trump. How did you, and what does it mean? So please let us welcome John Sides to the stage.
Thank you all so much. It's a real pleasure to be here in Carbondale and to honor the work of both Professors Morton and Kenney as well as the work of the Paul Simon Institute. Tobin forgot to mention, but I know the Simon Institute would like you to fill out this card that's in your program. And just to let you know, the correct answer to number 5 is learned a lot, and the correct answer to number 6 is very inspired, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. Tobin mentioned this site that I helped to run called the Monkey Cage, and if you want to know why it's called the Monkey Cage, it comes from a quote by the writer H.L. Mencken from the earlier part of the 20th century, and he said that democracy is the art of running the circus from the monkey cage. And somehow that quote has not lost its relevance in the last, 60 or so years, and it may seem particularly relevant in the wake of the 2016 election. Indeed, when I got the invitation in August, it seemed like this would be a pretty straight shot, no problem. I was unfortunately then confronted with an outcome that I wish I could stand before you and say that I anticipated or predicted. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This is something I wrote, the Washington Post, in August of 2015. People wanted to say that this time was different and a candidate like Trump could win, and I said, if Trump wins, then I'll admit I was wrong, and so this is actually the first public forum in which I've said that, and I want to actually even do more than that. I want to acknowledge, I would like to let the president himself tell me that I was wrong. So with that out of the way, And so I can try to keep my credentials as a political scientist for at least another few years. Let me do my best to offer some initial thoughts about what might explain Trump's unexpected victory and what it might then mean for at least the next several years of American politics. And here I think one of the challenges for political scientists is that when you have an election in which one candidate wins the popular vote by 2 points and the other candidate kind of relatively easily wins the Electoral College by around 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock on the Tuesday night of the election, it's not exactly an easy election to explain. It's not nearly as simple as I hoped it would be. And part of the challenge, I think, for political scientists in particular is there's really too many things that explain the election. You could maybe change 1 or 2 things and the outcome would be different. And so how can we pinpoint key factors when there are so many factors? I don't know how much you guys have read after the election, but then we can talk about a lot of things. We could talk about, how about the opioid epidemic and its effect on rural America? People say, well, what if Clinton had spent more time in the Rust Belt, right, campaigning to crucial groups of voters? People say, well, what about African-American turnout, right, which was lower than I think people wanted it to be or she expected it to be? Well, what about this? Okay, what about that? And if we're going to talk about fake news, we've got to talk about that guy, right? Okay? And for some of you, he's not the problem, it's this guy that's the problem, right? And so we could go through each of these factors and try to sort of, see how many angels can dance on the head of a pin and figure out like how much each of these things contributed. But what I can do at this stage, at least, not that long after the election, is try to focus on what I think are some bigger ticket items, more fundamental kinds of factors, and then talk about what role they played, while acknowledging that this is not the entire story, and then talk about what the implications of these factors then are for, the Trump presidency, at least thus far. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. My father's a minister. He said you always have to have 3 points in a sermon, okay? The number 3 is important in the Christian doctrine, right? So I'll talk about 3 things. First is something I think that, I don't know this was fully appreciated. It was not supposed to be easy for either candidate to win. It was supposed to be close. And I'll talk about why that is using some of the sort of basic findings that political scientists draw on when we think about how do we predict election outcomes in advance. I also want to talk about the Republican Party for a while. It didn't make up its mind very easily, as you could tell during the primary process. And when the party wasn't able to make up its mind, somebody else stepped in and did it for them. If I were in an academic forum, I would make that second statement with some necessary caveats and qualifiers, but for the sake of provocation, I'll just say it straight up. The media made up the Republican Party's mind for it. And then I want to talk a little bit about what Trump was tapping into in propelling himself both to the nomination and then to the presidency. And again, I'm not meaning to suggest that this is the only factor, but it really is a crucial one. And it's a factor that's going to be challenging, I think, for the country as a whole to deal with going forward. Anxieties that are tied to racial and ethnic and religious identities. So let me talk a little bit about this first thing. And I gotta give myself a slight bit of credit here, okay? Because this was a piece that I wrote in January of 2014. Hey, not bad, right? Not bad, right? Yes, thank you. Okay, that's the last time you'll see him. Sorry. That's not an applause line. It's just, I just don't want you to think you're going to have to see that repetition over and over again. And now let me be clear. I didn't write that because I thought that the Democrats were going to win the popular vote but lose the electoral vote. I was not even remotely that smart. But what I was basically just pointing out in 2014, and it was in reaction to a piece of reporting in the Post where some Republican consultants were really gloomy about his chances any Republican's chances of winning in 2016. They thought that basically the deck was stacked against them, the Democrats had an electoral college advantage or lock. People would talk about that swath of states, including places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, as the blue wall, right, that Republicans couldn't get over. And I said, wait a minute. Let's take a look at a couple things that are true. The economy's growing, but it's hardly growing gangbusters. The president at that point in time, and even into 2015 and early 2016, he's sort of popular, but not that popular. And then you have the fact that it's been difficult for one party to hold the White House for more than 2 terms, for most of the era after we limited the incumbent to 2 terms in office. And all of that just basically suggested that, if anything, at least as of 2014, it was perhaps actually conditions that were more favorable to the Republican Party. By 2015, early 2016, I would have updated that just to say it's a toss-up. Right? Neither party was strongly favored. Certainly for the Democrats, having a growing economy, having a president whose popularity was edging upward, right, into 2016 and throughout. That was good news. But the problem for the Democrats was that they didn't really have the incumbent on the ticket anymore. And so any benefits that you're going to get from that are going to be diminished when it's not the incumbent himself on the ticket. The successor's not going to benefit to the same extent. And then you have this, again, the third term curse, right, where you're not able to win the White House so easily the third term. So it's quite remarkable to me that that basic understanding of the election was very well borne out in the actual outcome. And a 2-point victory in the popular vote was very close to what a lot of these early forecasts would have suggested. One of the ways I can show that to you is just to give you now I'm going to show you some graphs, right, because this is political science, right, so buckle up, because there's going to be a lot of them. I can show you a graph that basically illustrates the relationship between trends in the economy in the election year and how well the incumbent party does, right? So the more the economy grows, the better the incumbent party does. That's not surprising. But what's striking about this graph, as you will see, is just how well the 2016 outcome was anticipated by that fact. So here I have a graph, or as we would say in political science, a scatter plot, which just kind of gets us excited. On the horizontal axis, you'll see it says growth rate in gross domestic product, first quarter to the third quarter of the election year. That's just capturing how much the economy is growing between basically January and the end of September of the election year. And then you have the incumbent party's percent of the major party votes. So take the third parties and the independents out of it and just calculate the incumbent party's share of the vote to the Democratic and Republican parties. And you can see, of course, that it's a positive relationship. And you guys who know your history, there's 1980 down there in the lower left. That's what Jimmy Carter was dealing with. Up in the upper right, there's 1984. That's what Walter Mondale was dealing with. And you've got 64 and 72 as other examples of pretty convincing incumbent party victories in the wake of a growing economy. And I've circled 2016 there just to show you it's right where we would have predicted if we hadn't known the outcome in advance. It's really not that surprising that she won by about 2 points given where the economy was at that particular point in time. So I just put that before you. Again, it's not to suggest that the economy is the only thing that explains elections. You can obviously see that there are elections that seem to vary a bit from what we would expect given the growth rate in the economy in a particular year. But it's just to have that in our back of our mind as a piece of context. And somebody here asked me if we could leave tonight on an optimistic note. And I think we're not going to. So maybe you should downgrade the inspiring line on your survey there. But there is one interesting thing to keep in mind about this. It just goes to suggest, right, that a lot of what's going to happen in politics is going to depend on these broader changes in the way that the country's going. And it's very rare for the things in the country to go so well for so long that one party gets to have power for a long time. Okay? So if you're disappointed in the outcome of the election, wait, and things will probably be in your favor. Okay, so that's just a piece of context. So now let's talk about the Republican primary. And really this is the key, I think, part of the story for the election as a whole. Maybe more important than the general election. Because to me, this was where normally a candidate like Trump would have been knocked out. But he wasn't. So why? So I think you start with this cast of characters. This is actually one candidate short. I apologize to former Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore, who is not pictured here, although that is somewhat symbolic of his campaign, unfortunately. So you have a big pool of candidates. On the one hand, that looks good, right? It's a deep bench, as they would say, right? Lots of candidates, lots of credible candidates, senators, governors, former governors, et cetera. On the other hand, though, it's a challenge, right? Because you've got to figure out who among these 16 people is the best, right? Or at least we've got to start to separate a couple of the top contenders from the rest of the field. And typically speaking, in presidential elections, since the advent of the primary, as the means by which we choose these candidates, political parties have tried to do some work before the actual vote starts, right? To try to figure out, okay, which of these candidates is the best? Let's throw some support behind them. Right? Let's throw some resources, let's throw endorsements, let's try to signal in a variety of ways that we think this candidate or these few candidates are at the top, and everyone else is really just in it for some other reason. They're not going to get very far. And I think what you guys have obviously observed in 2015 now, so we're looking at the year prior to the election, is that the Republican Party couldn't do that. Right? It couldn't do that at all. And the contrast with the Democratic Party is particularly striking. So let's use endorsements as an indicator of where the party is relative to these candidates. So when I talk about endorsements, I mean public endorsements. I mean endorsements before the Iowa caucus. After the Iowa caucus, that's easy, right? Jump on the bandwagon late, okay? But before the Iowa caucus, you got to put some skin in the game. And in particular, it's instructive to look at the endorsements by sitting governors, senators, and members of the House in a particular party. How many of those people endorsed, what percentage of them endorsed each of the candidates? So when you measure that, what's striking, right, of course, is Hillary Clinton's dominance. There's never been a candidate like her, especially in the Democratic Party, right, getting almost 80% of the endorsements of that pool of office holders, right? So almost all of those office holders not only endorsed someone, but they endorsed her. And candidates like Biden or O'Malley, I mean, they didn't really have, of course, Biden wasn't a candidate, obviously, formally. They really weren't able to get much traction, certainly Sanders similarly. Now, of course, this is not the end-all be-all, right, because Sanders had other strengths, but it was clear that she had a degree of support in the party that was going to make her very difficult to beat. And indeed, Sanders really never actually challenged her that seriously if you look at the actual delegate counts as the primaries and caucuses went on. Now, the Republican side, though, right? Even in 2012, when a lot of Republicans didn't endorse, a candidate like Romney looked strong because he actually got most of the endorsements among the ones that did endorse. But in 2016, 2015 in this case, you don't even see that, right? You have Bush getting about 9%, Rubio about 8%, Cruz about 5%, Paul has 3%, and of course, it will not surprise you that those endorsements are coming from very different parts of the party, right? So Bush's endorsers don't look ideologically like Cruz's endorsers do, right? Obviously, they're representing these different factions. And so from the get-go, Trump's not getting any endorsements, right? If anything, he's getting like anti-endorsements, okay? But who's the alternative to Trump? Well, there is no consensus on who that alternative should be for all of the reasons that I think you guys observed. There's a degree of factionalism in the party that predated the primary. All you have to do is go call John Boehner on the phone. I assume he's having a cigarette and a glass of Cabernet, right? Thanking his lucky stars that he's not anywhere near that place anymore, okay? So you can see in the things that Boehner faced, in the failure of immigration reform in 2013, all of these intra-party disputes among the Republicans on the Hill really, I think, presaged these kinds of disagreements or a lack of consensus at the primary stage. And it's not just that they couldn't coordinate on a candidate before the primaries began. Once it became clear that Trump was going to do well, they couldn't coordinate on a strategy to stop him. And because I'm working on this book about that campaign, I've been going back and trying to kind of reconstruct some of this from the news accounts. And there was a series of stories that were written basically within a month of each other in December and January. So December 2015, January 2016. And these are from BuzzFeed and the New York Times and the Washington Post. And they're all versions of the same story. Everyone can see what's happening, okay? Maybe some people still think it's gonna change, but they're not certainly gonna do anything about it. Right? When political scientists teach to like undergraduates, we talk about collective action problems, right? It would be good if we could all get together and do something, guys. Can we do that? No, because you don't wanna do it, and you don't wanna do it, and you're unwilling to do it, and you're unwilling to do it. Hey, but look, you've got all this money. Donors, Koch brothers, whoever. You could run some ads against Trump. Or you could decide who you want to support and put some more money behind their campaign. No. Okay. No one did anything. And so what you end up with then is a situation in which they couldn't coordinate on an alternative to Trump, and they couldn't even coordinate to attack Trump, even if they couldn't figure out who the alternative was supposed to be. So this is what characterizes the Republican Party situation all the way through. Now, from the standpoint of voters then, you don't have a signal that's coming from party leaders to suggest to you who might be a good candidate or the best candidate or the front runner, right? What you've got by the time the primary rolls around, the caucus rolls around in Iowa, let's say, is you've got like, what, about 12 candidates at that point, and you got to figure out who's the one to pay attention to, okay? So where are you going to get information then? Where's that signal going to come from? It's going to come from the news media, okay? Because we have to have information as voters to make choices, right? We don't make choices because we like wake up one morning and you're to roll over to your spouse and you're like, honey, you know what? Donald Trump should be the Republican nominee for president. You know, no one just wakes up and thinks that, right? You have to be signaled somehow, right, that Trump is someone worth paying attention to. And you know who knew that? Donald Trump, right? You don't have to go deep into the art of the deal, right, to get his theory of the case, okay? Talking about a business experience. Good publicity is preferable to bad, but from a bottom line perspective, bad publicity is sometimes better than no publicity at all. Controversy, in short, sells. He telegraphs basically his campaign in that quote. That's what he does. And it was actually very difficult, I think, for news outlets to turn away from that. And let's be clear, it was kind of difficult for us to turn away from that too. I'm not going to exonerate myself. Oh, no, please, give me more of Marco Rubio's plans for combating ISIS. Or, you know, like, I don't want to know who Trump is arguing with today. So let me show you a little bit of data about this, where we have sort of two, in this project, big sources of media data. One of these comes from an outfit that's been collecting cable network transcripts from not just the big cable news shows, but from other kind of cable networks like CNBC and Fox Business and Comedy Central and Bloomberg. And they tabulate every single time a candidate's name is mentioned, okay, which is pretty remarkable. And so one of the neat things you can do with that is you can calculate, okay, how many mentions did Trump have? That's the numerator. And the denominator is how many mentions did all the Republican candidates have together? Okay, so what's his fraction of the total number of mentions in these cable network transcripts? And then a second source of data comes from a company called Cripps and Hexagon, and they're one of these companies that basically collects all of these data from online news sources of various kinds. And for each story that they collect from an online news source, they categorize, did that story mention a particular candidate, right? Did they mention Trump or Bush or Rubio or Cruz? And of course, most stories mention more than one candidate. But even then, you can get a sense of one candidate's dominance by looking at how many stories, what percentage of stories mention that candidate. And I'm going to show you both of these lines for Trump for the duration of the primary, beginning before he announced his candidacy. Okay? So in the purple line, that's the cable news data from the transcript. So that's the percentage of mentions of all the Republican candidates that were mentions of Trump. And then the red line is the percentage of stories that mention Trump in this larger set of online news outlets. And a couple things to note about this graph. Looking at the purple line just for a second, and I want you to sort of visually imagine, like, what's the average across this time period? Okay, it's about 50%. Okay, so 50% of the mentions of the candidates in cable news coverage are mentions of Donald Trump, and the other 50% are for the other 16 candidates. Okay, that's what that basically means. And you can see that that's true very quickly after he announces his candidacy. Right? The initial controversy that his speech caused, which we will revisit in a minute, was what led to that. And you can see he actually succeeds in using controversy to get news coverage at multiple points in the campaign. I've highlighted three: his attack on John McCain, right, for failing to be sufficiently heroic in war, his mention that we needed a database of Muslims living in this country, and his call for a temporary ban on immigration by Muslims into this country. Of course, all of these things were met with opposition by both Republicans and Democrats alike, but nevertheless, it was good for publicity. Okay. Now, of course, there are a few moments where he isn't as dominant, and in particular, you can see that in late October and early November, that is the brief tenure of Ben Carson at the top of the news and the polls. And you can see, of course, that in the wake of the Iowa caucus, when Trump sort of did not as well as was expected, and Rubio did better than expected. Of course, that means that Rubio's coverage increases relative to Trump's. But for the most part, he's dominating. And I could spend like a long time on that subject. But suffice it to say that from a simple media and politics 101 perspective, Trump delivers what the news needs all the time. And he delivers what we want to look at a lot of the time. And other candidates in that situation were struggling. It's not that all the coverage of Trump was good, right, like he said. It's not all good publicity. But at the same time, from the standpoint of 16 other candidates striving for oxygen to stand out in a fractured field, it's just difficult to find it when one candidate's able to take up so much time in print, online, especially on television. And the ratings, right? People like Jeff Zucker at CNN, Les Moonves at CBS. I'll quote Les Moonves, paraphrasing. "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for us." He said that. So I don't even have to like cast aspersions, right? They said it. It was good for ratings. And so again, when you have that marriage of a set of news organizations with a set of incentives, right, to maximize audience and revenue, and you have a candidate with a set of tactics that are very good for increasing audience and revenue, it's not surprising then that he was able to get as much coverage as he could. And again, had he been facing one opponent, one big opponent maybe, it would have been a different story, right? But when you didn't have any agreement on the alternative, and then you have him doing what he does, that's where I think you get, a real challenging thing. Let me, by the way, just show you that it actually did affect the way that his poll numbers moved over time. So take that red line in your mind. Now imagine I'm going to draw like an average through it to sort of smooth out some of that up and down motion, okay? Kind of get some signal and less noise. And I'm going to put that alongside his national polling numbers. Same thing, I'm going to smooth the polling numbers out so it doesn't bounce around because of random sampling error and stuff like that. I'm going to put those two lines together. News on the bottom, polls on the top. I mean, if you like, do you like correlation coefficients? The highest correlation coefficient, a positive correlation coefficient, is 1. That's a correlation of 0.94. So every time Trump's news, this is just the volume of coverage, right? This is not even how positive or negative, right? When it goes up, his poll numbers go up. When the coverage goes down, his poll numbers go down or at least kind of stabilize. Okay? So, and again, and for the reason I suggested with my little joke about waking up and telling your spouse, right? It's the news that moves first, because no one's making up their mind or changing their mind without that new information. Now, at a certain point, there's absolutely an interaction here where good poll numbers justify more news coverage, or more news coverage is good for poll numbers for the most part. So I'm not suggesting that it's just, there's no sort of reciprocation going on between these two trend lines. But I think clearly the media is a key mover here. Okay. All right, so, we're left with validation of what Trump said as a story. Okay, now, last piece of the puzzle, though. Which voters, though, right? Trump's poll numbers go up. Among whom, right? Which parts of the Republican Party, and then ultimately this is going to carry into the general election as well. So I want to bring you back to the state of the party after the 2012 election, when the defeat of Barack Obama was apparently surprising to many, the election of Barack Obama was apparently surprising to many in the Republican Party, and this occasioned a lot of gloom and doom and sort of discussion about what the party should do next. And so the Republican National Committee asks a group of Republican leaders to write a report called the Growth and Opportunity Project, GOP, get it? And if you go, you can find this file still online. It's like an 80-page PDF you can download and read. And if you do, you'll see this statement here about getting ethnic minority voters to support Republicans, engaging them, showing them our sincerity. Now, the committee didn't want us to make specific policy recommendations, as you can see, but we have to embrace and champion comprehensive immigration reform, okay? So this is where the party is. The party basically says we have to change our platform and really our sort of language to appeal to this large, growing segment of the electorate, particularly in the Latino community, okay? And that's the conventional wisdom. This is why the Democrats were supposed to be so dominant. That's why they were so pessimistic in that story in 2014 that I was responding to. Because he just couldn't imagine that the Democrats of the country could help a Republican candidate win anymore without changes like this. So basically, I'm going to suggest that that is a very heroic view of where you can take the Republican Party, given some of the demographic trends that have been happening within the party, up to that point and even subsequent to that point. One thing that I think is not well appreciated is that the Republican coalition before 2012 and even after 2012 was moving in pretty much the opposite direction as what this report would suggest. Okay, so this is just how I think much of a heavy lift this recommendation really was. So let me show you a little bit of data about that and how the party coalitions were changing. So I want to show you just party coalition by sort of the Democratic or Republican advantage in each group by race, and then among whites, let's break it down by, do you have a college degree, do you have some college but no college degree, or do you have a high school degree or less? Okay, so the Democratic advantage at the top, this is just, do you identify with or lean towards the Democratic Party? This is not how you vote. You can see, of course, blacks at the top, right? Obviously strongly Democratic. You can see Asian and Hispanic, somewhat Democratic. You can see the trend, especially among Hispanics over this time period. But the real, I think, the action here is among whites. So if you follow, see the dark line right there? Okay, that's whites with a high school degree or less. And I want you to watch that line bounce around the 0 point, right, up until, oh, who took office at that moment, right? Okay. There's a big trend starting in 2009, and notice, by the way, that's 2015, right where my dot is, okay? All of that happened, okay, in the Obama presidency. And let me also note that everything, look at that sort of trend after Obama won a second term, but before Trump really is a significant factor, okay? And look what's happening to whites with a college degree, right? It's the opposite. Okay, so we used to live in a world, right, where there weren't that many differences between whites based on their level of formal education. Now we live in a world where whites are trending towards the Democrats if they have a college degree, but if they don't have a college degree, they're trending towards the Republicans. That predates Donald Trump, and I think that's not appreciated. If you just looked at the 12 outcome and the 16 outcome, you'd say Trump switched this. No, it was already switching. The ground was moving underneath him, and it was moving in the opposite way, I think, than the Republican Party was thinking when they wrote this Growth and Opportunity Project report. I'm going to give you 4 graphs at once, so hang tight with me. It is also the case that among white voters, the people that were moving away from the Democratic Party during this period, both among whites overall and among whites without a college degree, these were also voters who expressed less favorable views towards African Americans. So I'll show you that several different ways. So this is a measure here in the upper left, right? You see it says racial resentment. So this is a measure that's built on a series of questions that ask people whether they agree or disagree with statements like, if blacks would just try harder, they could be as well off as whites. So basically, these questions are asking people to express the view that blacks are just not working very hard, okay, or not doing enough. You know, it doesn't say the word lazy, right? But that's kind of the implication. So people who have, right, sort of score higher on that scale move down towards the Republican Party over this period, and people who score lower on that scale move towards the Democrats. And note, right, the split, in particular, widening in 2008 and 2012. You can also use other questions that measure people's attitudes towards race. This is whether you oppose or support interracial dating. Now, that's not a large number of people that oppose interracial dating. It's about 15% of Americans, right? So it's not the majority view by any stretch. But you can see how strongly those people move towards the Republican Party. That didn't used to be an issue that divided whites, all right? And now it does, in terms of their partisanship. If you go and you break down whites by whether they have a high school degree or less here, and whether they have at least some college education here, this is just to show you that most of the movement under the Obama era is here, right, among people who have less favorable views towards blacks and have a formal education of a high school degree or less. Those trends don't really exist over here. This is a group for whom the movement towards the different parties on the basis of racial attitudes really happened early on, before Obama took office. So again, right, these are just trends showing you, right, that the parties are becoming better sorted by what they think about African Americans in this case, but it's not just African Americans. okay? This is the percentage of people who rate Muslims favorably, who lean towards the Democratic Party, and people who rate Muslims unfavorably. So you can see, right, over time, if you rate Muslims unfavorably, right, those people become much more strongly Republican, particularly in the Obama era. And you can see a similar movement now, and this is on both sides now, in terms of whether you support or oppose further restrictions on immigration. If you oppose further restrictions on immigration, here you are moving towards the Democratic Party. If you oppose those restrictions, here you are moving against the Democratic Party, moving more strongly to the Republican Party. That graph stops in 2012, by the way. Right, so this is, again, this is all prior, right, to, I mean, Donald Trump's around, right, doing the birther thing and all that stuff, but he's not, like, you know, nearly has the salience and the visibility that he did as a presidential candidate. Okay. So again, this is just to show you that the roots of this stuff was in place. Now, it's not to say that it was inevitable, right? Because you have to have a candidate that's willing to campaign in a way that makes those things come to the fore. And of course, that's what Trump does. And he does it in a way that's different than other Republican candidates prior and in 2016 itself. Now, this is the quote that I referred to before from his speech announcing his candidacy in June of 2015. Okay, so you all know this. I don't have to read this to you. You know the language that he's using here. They're not sending us the right people. Okay. So this, gets him, he loses his Macy's contract. I think he loses a couple of other deals immediately in the wake of this, right? So this is controversial from the get-go. And you can go through the headlines over time, and you can find a jillion of all this stuff all day long. That top piece is written by a conservative writer named Ben Dominick, who writes for a site called The Federalist. These are the young conservatives, okay? This is not the old guard establishment, blah, 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 right? This is the young guys. And he basically wrote that piece in August of 2015. And he wrote that because he was anxious that it was turning from conservatism to white identity politics. And then you have the debate about immigration, the Muslim ban, then this stuff with David Duke, right? It just keeps happening and happening and happening. So what we would expect then is that in the primary, your feelings about immigration, your feelings about African Americans, your feelings about whites, right, should be more strongly related to your support for Trump relative to the other candidates than it was when you look at 2008 and support for John McCain, or you look at 2012 and support for Mitt Romney. Okay? So we have data from all three of these elections, and we can show that exactly that pattern. What you have here is just a simple, do you favor or oppose a path to citizenship? Not really related to whether you supported Romney or McCain. Maybe McCain did a little better among people who favored that in 2008. But in 2016, that has a dramatic effect. And by the way, that measure in 2016 is from 2011. We have the same respondents that we interviewed in 2011 and 2012. We interviewed them again in 2016. So this is not people saying that they oppose a path to citizenship because they heard Donald Trump say it. These are people who said in 2011, I oppose a path to citizenship. And that is still predictive of how they voted in a primary 5 years later. Okay? Same thing with this measure of support for attitudes for African Americans. It's the same racial resentment measure that I mentioned before. Not really related to views or support for Romney or McCain, strongly related to views of Trump. And again, that's a measure from 2011, driving people's support for Trump in 2016. Okay, so these identity issues are coming to the fore in unusual ways in the primary. Let me show you something about white people, or whiteness. This is also striking and different in 2016. So on the left-hand side, I just want to show you, comparing two different questions that were asked in surveys in 2016. One was just a survey question, are you worried about losing your job? Okay, are you not worried? Are you somewhat worried? Are you very worried? Right, so that makes no mention of race or ethnicity or anything. And you can see Trump does a little bit better among people who are at least somewhat or very worried about losing their job. That's consistent with the story about economic anxiety. But a much stronger predictor is this question, how likely do you think it is that whites will not be able to find a job because employers have to give jobs to minorities? So if you said that was not likely, right, you were not particularly supportive of Trump, but if you said that was extremely likely, you were 40 points more supportive of Trump. So that sort of suggests that a lot of people's concerns about economic circumstances are refracted, right, through group identity kinds of issues that Trump has made more salient to them. This is the question in the right-hand graph here from 2012 and 2016 that asked whether you think there is, how much discrimination you think there is against whites. none at all the way up to a great deal. And you can see that that has a little bit of relationship to whether you supported Romney in 2012 in the primary, but it has a much stronger relationship to whether you supported Trump in the primary in 2016. Okay, so these are these identity issues coming to the fore. And then when you get to the general election campaign, it's the same story. And part of the reason it's the same story is because of this, right? Clinton. She's not going to try to diffuse the issue by taking some more conservative position on immigration. There was a time when Democrats would do that, right? If you know your 1992 campaign history, you know Bill Clinton, right? Lectured a black woman rapper who he thought he said something inflammatory as a way to signal, right, that he wasn't, he was sensitive to maybe how some whites would react to that, statements that she had made. Clinton's slogan really suggests something different, right? It's a different approach to thinking about the challenges of diversity, right, in a country that's increasingly non-white. And it's predicated on the idea that, we are stronger together, right? It's not about make America great again. It was better then. It's not so good now. It's we're all here together. We can do this together. We're stronger together. So this is not to suggest that Clinton's responsible for this. It's just to say that she's going to offer a different story, a different contrast to kind of maintain this difference between the two candidates that was similar, frankly, to the difference between someone like Bush and someone like Trump, right? Because Bush wasn't going to make an argument like Trump either. So one of the interesting things when we look at these people that we interviewed in 2011 and 2012 and then again in 2016, so we know what they did in 2012 and we know what they did in 2016. We can look at how they moved, right? And about 5% of people who voted for Romney said they voted for Clinton. But about 10% of people that voted for Obama voted for Trump. And in particular, if you look at just whites with no college degree, I think 22% of them who voted for Obama voted for Trump. Right? That's what you guys know from reading the story. But I think what we can show is that looking at people's attitudes towards immigration in 2011 would tell us a lot about who's going to switch. Okay? So we measured people's attitudes towards immigration by asking them, should we increase or decrease immigration or keep it the same? Should there be a pathway to citizenship, yes or no? And do you think that illegal immigrants make a contribution to society or are mostly a drain? Okay, so you put those three questions together in a scale that runs from more favorable views of immigration to less favorable views of immigration. So this is the percentage of white Obama voters who supported Trump based on their views of immigration. So you go from positive views to negative views, and you go from almost a 0% chance of switching to vote for Trump to a 33% chance of switching to vote for Trump. And the same thing's true among white Romney voters who supported Clinton. You can see that the likelihood of switching from Romney to Clinton is much higher if you have a positive view of immigration. What are those little gray bars at the bottom there? They're giving you a sense of what was the distribution or what was the sort of spread of attitudes towards immigration in each of these two groups as of 2011. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that there's no one down here. Okay? I mean, it's nice for Clinton to get some votes from Romney voters who have positive views of immigration. There's just not a lot of them, based on those three questions. How many are there over here? Right, a lot more. So about 1/3 of white Obama voters said that illegal immigrants are a drain. About 1/3 said that we should decrease the immigration coming to this country. Some commentators had talked about this during the campaign, but it was genuinely underappreciated that there was a substantial fraction of white Obama supporters who did not have liberal views on immigration or issues related to race and ethnicity. They had significant concerns, indeed, about those things. And so, again, when you have a campaign that proceeds in the fall, much the way it did in the spring, you're getting some of these same issues being activated, driving people's choices in this way. Okay, so let me wrap up and say a few things about what does it all mean. So the first thing I think that's important to note is what I suggested when we talked about the role of the economy. Republican dominance hardly guaranteed. I cannot tell you how many stories were written in the few months after the election about, the Democrats are done, the Democrats are finished, where will the Democrats go next? I remember those stories that were written about the Republicans in 2012. You just swap the party labels, right? And it's the same set of stories. And now we're having this presentation at a moment right, after a special election in Kansas, right, where the Democrats did really, really well. And so now the tide is turning, right? And we shouldn't pin our hopes on a special election in Kansas or a special election in Georgia if you're a Democrat. Don't pin your hopes on that, okay? But you should, if you're a Democrat, think, right, there'll be some cycles here, right? Okay? It's the same way if you're a Republican, you can't get cocky, okay? Remember, because I mean, all you have to do is walk through it, right? George Bush becomes president in 2000, has unified control of Congress, loses the House in 2006, loses the White House, loses the Senate in 2008, then the Democrats lose the House in 2010, then they win the presidency in 2012, but lose the Senate in 2014. All right, then the Democrats lose the presidency in 2016, okay? And now what are we talking about? Are the Republicans going to lose the House in 2018? Okay, so again, like, you know, those cycles are there and they're meaningful. We should never assume that one party's victory means one party is going to continue to win. The second thing I think is important is that I'm already seeing this phrase, Trump's takeover of the Republican Party. And I don't think that's remotely accurate, okay, remotely accurate. And as I was literally sitting here today, like, working on this, I was watching, like, the tweets start to come. Trump says NATO's not obsolete after all. Trump said, actually, China's not a currency manipulator. Actually, Trump says the dollar's too strong. Trump says, oh yeah, the Export-Import Bank, we should keep that, it's good. Right, so is Trump changing the Republican Party or is the Republican Party changing Trump, right? I mean, you know, so I think we should be cautious about assuming that Trump's politics become the Republican Party's platform. That said, I think there's uncertainty. There are interesting stories where you talk to conservatives and they're like, I used to call myself a conservative, but I'm not quite sure what that means because I'm not Ted Cruz, but I'm not Donald Trump, but I'm not establishment. What am I? Right? You know, so that's the uncertainty. And I think even without Trump, you would still have the factionalism that existed prior to the primary. You would still have Republicans divided about immigration. Even without Trump in the race, you were going to have an argument between Bush and Rubio on the one hand and Ted Cruz on the other. So I don't know that the parties figured out how to deal with those disagreements. And that's a big issue they're going to have to work on. It's clear that Trump, of all the things he promised in the campaign, the stuff he really wants to follow up through on are the immigration items, right? So I don't know what that's going to mean for the rest of the party. But I don't think that there's any consensus behind what Trump is doing on those domains. I don't think Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio, these people have changed their minds. So if they don't solve these issues, it's just going to come up again. They're going to have the same challenges. And I don't know what Trump's going to do in 2020. I don't know if he'll be in the, people ask me, a student asked me today, will he be out of office by 2020? Because the betting markets give him like 50-50 odds of finishing the first term in the presidency. And I don't have any money. I'm not betting on that market. I don't have anything to say. But it's just to say that you're going to set up a situation that's going to look a lot like 2016 or 2012 if you can't figure out what kind of candidate can be a consensus builder or a unifier in the party. Who is it right now? Paul Ryan? Right, no. That guy is so unpopular among Republicans. I don't know who it is. So it's just going to continue to happen. All right, and this is the thing where I can't leave you with an inspirational point at the very end. But I don't know how to put that toothpaste back in the tube. You know, these are pretty dramatic cleavages that are relatively recent, some of them, but are speaking to, I think, fundamental changes in the country that are not going to stop. And these are issues that are emotionally charged and felt deeply. And it is possible for candidates to campaign differently than Donald Trump did, right? And that might mean that we have a campaign that's less about those issues or more about other issues. Maybe we go back to arguing about the size of government or things we used to argue about even more. But I do think that when you have parties that are, when you have one party that's increasingly the party of college-educated whites who tend to have relatively liberal views on issues related to race and ethnicity, as well as racial minorities in that party, and this party is whites who have lower levels of formal education and more concerns, frankly, about those issues. It's hard not to imagine that those set of issues are going to kind of occur and reoccur as points of cleavage, absent some other kinds of broader societal trends that create a greater degree of comfort with the diverse country that we're increasingly becoming. So with that, I'll leave off, and I'd be happy to take some questions for at least a few minutes if anybody wants to ask. There's a microphone that you can, if you want to speak. or raise your hand and.
So I get that you were talking about leading up and what caused Trump to get the Republican nomination, but what about sexism and the you know, and to me that seemed like there was a lot of people who just said, I don't want a woman.
Yeah, this is a really interesting, and the fact that I don't have nice graphs about that topic is not because we're not trying to figure this out, it's just because we don't know the story quite yet. I don't yet know, right, that a measure, let's say sexism, is going to be a strong predictor of your vote relative to just say partisanship or the other stuff that creates the natural divisions that we have in politics. I don't yet know that that's the case. I will say, though, that I'm more comfortable talking about sort of the flip side of that, which is the extent to which kind of solidarity with a woman candidate or other women, call it feminism if you like, was not a strong motivator for a lot of women. That was, I think, true in the primary, particularly among younger generations, right? I mean, older generations more so, I think, felt that attachment. Women felt that attachment to Clinton as a woman in the primary. But in the general election, it's not quite clear. One of the things that the political science literature has often observed about gender is it's been tougher to, gender identity is generally not as strong as racial and ethnic identities are. You know, we have not lived in a world in which the genders are segregated the way the races have been segregated. We have not lived in a world where there's perceived direct competition over resources between racial groups or ethnic groups, right? You know, you hear immigrants are taking our jobs a lot more than you hear women are taking our jobs, right? Even though the movement of women into the labor force is probably the biggest trend of the last, you know, one of the biggest social trends of the last 50 years. So I do think there was maybe a lack of kind of affinity that would have supported Clinton among women. I'm not yet sure, but I'm not ruling out the possibility that the negative views were also a challenge for her. And I will say that one of the difficulties here for social scientists is, like, we don't have a good experiment here. There's been only one woman major party nominee, so it's hardly like we have a bunch of cases we can look at. So I think anything I can say about that isn't necessarily qualified by that limitation. Thank you for the question. Yes, sir. There's one in the back. So some of the reporting that's come out since suggests that members of his team saw some of this. So Kellyanne Conway was a pollster, right? That was before she had that broad kind of role that she has on the Trump campaign and now at the Trump administration. And there was some reporting now that suggests that even as of 2014, you know, she had poll results that she was taking around town saying, look, immigration, people care about immigration. And there was also some reporting that suggested that early on in the Trump campaign, they spent a lot of time just listening to talk radio and just absorbing it, okay? Almost like doing ethnography or anthropology or something. And they came away with this sense that, man, there's a lot of concern about immigration. And so I don't know that Trump himself knew that. You know, I mean, Trump clearly has some interesting and oftentimes maybe good intuitions about politics, but it's not clear to me that he had that sort of strategy per se. And one of the interesting things about Trump on this issue is, like, if you go back and you look at things he said, it's not quite, like, he sort of, not surprisingly, said multiple things. Like, in 2011, he suggested we should put the US Army on the border, militarize the border, which is a big deal. Then in 2012, after Romney lost, when he was piling on Romney, he said Romney's problem was that they didn't have a plan on immigration. Moreover that, they just weren't nice about it. And I was like, what? Okay. Rapists? You know, like, I don't know, it doesn't sound nice. Trump on this issue, I don't know. On trade, he's been pretty consistent since the late 80s. You know, he's not a big fan of these trade agreements, but on immigration, he seems to be a little bit over the map. But it's clear that I think that whoever was telling him these things, or whatever advice he was getting, even as of June 2015, he thought that there was a pressure point here. And I think he was correct in that. So that's one of the things that makes the issue so challenging. There's a question in the back, right there. Yes, ma'am, you.
Hi, my question is about money in politics. So it seems like Trump's campaign was kind of an anomaly because in the beginning of the campaign, Jeb Bush had a ton of money, Scott Walker had lots of Koch brothers money,
Yep.
and it didn't seem to matter. So do you think that going forward, we're going to see the same kind of pattern where money will matter less, and we're not talking about the Supreme Court's decision anymore? Or do you think that Trump is just an anomaly in what he is?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It is really fun to remember the early days of the 2016 campaign when the Koch brothers were going to spend $1 billion, and people were like, "Oh, money in politics," you know. And then Trump comes along and doesn't actually raise all that much money in the grand scheme, and wins anyway. It's remarkable. The turnabout from what we thought we were going to be experiencing. Is it a model, though? I doubt it very seriously. You know, this question and another question that was asked of me at lunch today and with some students, really good question was basically like, do you think other candidates want to emulate Trump's style on Twitter? Right? And so you can kind of give, I think, a similar answer to both sets of questions. I don't think many candidates are so risk averse, or I should say risk acceptant, that they're like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm not going to raise money, but I am going to send a lot of angry tweets. Right? Like I just don't think that most candidates in either party think that's a replicable model. And even if there are elements of that they'd like to bring to bear, like maybe they want their tweets to be a little more aggressive or something, it seems to me difficult to imagine that candidates are willing to embrace that. I think in part because people do see it as a natural outgrowth of the, shall we say, unique aspects of Trump's personality, and not so much as a playbook, right, to be emulated. I think the bigger question would be on an issue like trade. Do Republicans start to think that Trump makes sense and maybe the party needs to sort of shift its views in a more protectionist direction? Like that to me is a more plausible change. I don't know if the tactical stuff will be as important. The Koch brothers, by the way, are spending lots and lots of money right now opposing Trump, right? And so, you know, I don't think any of these actors are all of a sudden going to say, well, I guess I better pack up shop and go home. I'll find something else to do with my billions, you know, more art or museums, docent work or something, I don't know. So that's my sense at the moment, at least. I would, for example, I would not expect the midterms to be particularly inexpensive, you know, given the level of competitiveness that we're already seeing in some of these districts. There were some other hands. Yes, sir, right there.
This election has been interesting because of what seems to have been the influence of the Russians that's being investigated at the present time. I don't know if we're aware of this has happened in the past in previous election cycles or not, but how do you as a political scientist trying to study this election analyze the influence, seeming influence of the Russian activities that might have been potentially sufficient enough to maybe change enough votes in Michigan, or Wisconsin, or Pennsylvania, or other states to actually tip the election from Trump to Hillary. And we'd be having a very different discussion right now, but could be happening in the midterms coming up, and could have a significant influence on elections going forward.
Yeah.
And how do we deal with this from an academic standpoint or from a more one of safeguarding our political structures?
Sure, no, these are very good questions. This is a tricky one. So I think we can, do I want to set aside, like there's lots of different things that people think put under the banner of Russia. So I want to set aside the issue of did the Trump campaign have contacts with Russia, which is being investigated by committees and by the FBI. So just put that over there for a second. So to me, thinking about the influence of Russia on the actual election, I mean, as a social scientist, I have to say, okay, like some message or communication that originated because of Russian activity reached X number of voters and changed the minds of enough of those voters to equal, right, tens of thousands of votes across these different states. Okay, so how would the Russians have done that? Well, one thing they did is they hacked the DNC, got a bunch of emails, and then dumped them out via WikiLeaks. So one question would be, how much influence did the WikiLeaks dump of the DNC emails have on the race, right? And there I think it's tricky. It was also coming at a time when there was lots of bad stuff about Donald Trump, right? And so it's not quite clear that Clinton took a hit in the polls. At the same time, it kept the email thing alive for a while because those were different emails. But just email was in the news, and so I don't know that voters were able to distinguish Clinton's email server from the DNC hack. The other piece of it would be the fake news, right? So that these guys in wherever they are, Belarus or whatever, feeding fake stories onto Facebook that get shared across Facebook. And I think there it's difficult to know how many people saw them, how many people believe them, how many people that otherwise would have voted for Clinton saw some false story. Clinton has multiple sclerosis, right? Or whatever they were saying after she fainted, and therefore changed their mind. There's been one study that's tried to estimate the impact of that, and it came up with a small number that probably wasn't a game changer from the standpoint of the actual election outcome. So in my mind, and I put it this way, I think Clinton's problem was not the fake news, it was the real news, right? When the only times that she got more coverage than Trump were when Comey talked about her emails or when she fainted. That's true, actually, from our data. It suggests that she was going to struggle to sort of deal with this storyline, some of it our own making, of course, about the emails, and I think that was probably a bigger challenge for her overall than these made-up stories that were coming. None of that, however, suggests that we should be anything less than vigilant about the security of our communication, and the fact that Russians are doing the same things to help the far right in France, right, and other places also should raise some degree of concern. And I don't know that there's an easy solution to it, which makes it all the more difficult because, some of this internet stuff is a wild west kind of environment, and it's difficult to come up with algorithmic changes to Facebook that eliminate all the fake news, but only keep the true stuff, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg, get to work, right? But I don't know how to accomplish that very easily. One more question, I'm told. Give me a yes, ma'am. Let me note that she asked me a question in class today, so she is getting, right? This is good.
There's a lot to talk about.
Yes.
After seeing Trump, after seeing Trump intentionally manipulate the media for coverage, whether that be good or bad, do you think that future Republican candidates are going to adopt his sort of rhetoric? And if so, is there any kind of check back on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think Republicans learned, we should tell John McCain that he's not a war hero. I don't think a lot of Republicans want a Muslim ban exactly either, although it's tougher to say that now that he's the president, right? But if you go back to what they said when he announced it the first time, Paul Ryan called it unconstitutional. Jeb Bush said, no way, Jose, there was a lot of, Dick Cheney said it was a bad idea. You can go down the list. Reince Priebus, said it was a bad idea. So I think there are boundaries that Trump crossed that I don't think a lot of Republicans want to cross. That said, I do wonder if Trump's success makes Republicans even more wary about approaching an issue like immigration reform. And I do wonder if it makes them wary of opposing increased efforts to enforce and deport undocumented immigrants. Right? That's what's going to happen, right? If Trump can do what he wants to do with enforcement. So I do wonder if it's. I'm not expecting to hear the same rhetoric, but I do wonder if it's going to make it even more challenging for Republicans to articulate the view that the Growth and Opportunity Project was trying to articulate in the wake of the election. I think that poses some real risks to the party. It's not the case, I think I said this today, if you heard it for the second time, I apologize. But I do think that for Latinos, especially as Latinos sort of become more acculturated, like if you look at sort of data on like second, third, fourth generation, native born, American citizens, their attitudes don't look like Latinos who are first generation, right, or recently arrived in this country. They look a little bit more like white attitudes on some issues. That said, I think that immigration is so central for Latinos because it really speaks to their own identity in a way that other economic issues or other kinds of issues don't. And so I think the challenge for the party is if you learn the lesson from Trump, we should be, take a more sort of consistent, strong stand against undocumented immigration, put other kinds of restrictions on immigration. Are you basically telling Latinos, we don't like people like you, and it doesn't matter what other issues Latinos might agree with the Republican Party on, the gateway issue is immigration. You got to find a way into that gate, and then maybe you can start a conversation about tax reform or other kinds of issues that might be important to Latinos. So that's my sense of where I think the party is going to go with this issue. I don't think it's going to be. I think there's a long-term question they still have to figure out the answer to, even if they don't want to adopt the language of Trump on this issue consistently. So thank you for the question. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.